It's good. Always good. Right. Well, I think what we'll between Terry and I, we're gonna be bouncing back and forth between Micah and Daniel, and today is Daniel. So um let me get this rascal up here. Okay, so anyway, so we kind of do a little bit of review to kind of remember where we at are were I um so we are this week in chapter 5, and it's Belshazzar's feast, and I'm thinking I could subtitle that a bummer of a party. And it was anyway, and next week we'll look at it from a different point of view and call it the deception of wealth. Will Shane Wood, his lesson, he looks at these in a little different way. So we'll look at chapter 5 from that perspective next week. But week before last, we were looking at chapter 4 of Daniel, and we kind of look at ways that you could convert an enemy to a friend, and you could refuse to be their enemy. We could forgive them, let them know we're sincere. We could do them a favor, praise them behind their back, um, make them believe they're their enemy, and you can love them. And he was talking about two ways that we can obliterate or destroy our enemy. One is to kill them, and the other is to make them into a friend. And so preferably we would want to make them into a friend. But then talked about true humility, and I think what he was saying in there is true humility is that we think of ourselves no higher or no lower than we are. We kind of think, okay, where we are in reality with regard to other men and women and God, and not put ourselves up too high or too low. And then talking about true contentment, and it kind of boils down to that old proverb or saying, "Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, and the courage to change things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." That's kind of what you would be content. So we're not striving after things that we can't get, and we aren't fretting over those things that are beyond our reach, but we are doing the things that we can do that God has called us to do. So with that, let's just look at a short video summary of what this chapter is about, and then we'll look at the scripture in more detail.
It was the 12th of October in the year 539 BC, and it was during the reign of the Babylonian monarch Belshazzar. And this king, well, he knew how to party. He liked to party. And one night he organized a big party. In fact, the chapter that tells his story begins with a party. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. His lords, his wives, his concubines, not only drinking wine, but drinking them from the sacred vessels that had been part of the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem, pillaged decades earlier by his father Nebuchadnezzar. using the very vessels consecrated to the worship of the true God. They offered praise to the pagan gods of gold and silver. They mixed the elements of the worship of God with pagan practice. They combined truth with error, and it brought an immediate response from God. Amid all the sacrilege and revelry, an event occurred that brought all festivities to a halt. In the same hour, the fingers of a man appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. If you ever wondered where the phrase, the handwriting on the wall, originated from, well, here it is. No question. This was strange and shocking. And the king's reaction to it says a lot. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. Does that not sound like a guilty conscience, or what? Belshazzar knew he'd been rude and defiant to God, and so he was anxious and worried about what the writing meant. The king called for the wise men of Babylon to interpret the writing. And he was so desperate for an interpretation that Belshazzar promised whoever gave it to him would get a lot of rewards, including to be third ruler in the kingdom. However, none were able to. The queen, seeing the king's consternation, then told him about Daniel. She said that he definitely could interpret this writing for the king. So Daniel was called in, and the king, after flattering him, offered him great rewards if he could help. Daniel, however, cut straight to the chase, saying that he had no interest in any reward. After chiding Belshazzar for his arrogance and for his blasphemy by parting with the sacred vessels, Daniel then interpreted the words, the writing on the wall, saying, and this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upasin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Talk about direct and to the point. And sure enough, just as predicted, Belshazzar's reign ended that very night when the Medo-Persians overthrew the city. Mighty Babylon had fallen. It was the defiling act of taking the vessels that were consecrated to the worship of the true God and mixing them with pagan worship that brought the wrath of God upon Belshazzar and Babylon. Ancient Babylon fell when it defied God by mixing the worship of God with paganism. And let's remember that everything in the book of Daniel, including the story of Belshazzar and the fall of Babylon, is focusing on last day events, our times. The Bible makes it very clear in the book of Revelation, Daniel's sister book, that there will be another Babylon at the time of the end. Now, the Babylon spoken of in Revelation is not the same as the Babylon of Daniel's day. It became a heap of ruins. The Bible tells the rise of another Babylon, which will do the same to the people who follow God as did ancient Babylon. Modern Babylon, according to the book of Revelation, is the final great oppressor of the people of God. We must be vividly aware that both Daniel and Revelation warn us against a false system of religion that mixes paganism with Christianity and yet claims to worship God. In the last days, in our time, this false system of religion will try to force people to worship God falsely by mixing paganism and Christianity, just as ancient Babylon defied God by mixing elements of the worship of God with paganism. How important it is that we be as faithful as Daniel, so that we are not corrupted by modern Babylon. How important it is that we remain loyal and true to the Bible. That's our only safety. to learn more about the.
Okay, well, let's look at there. One of the things that I guess excites me about studying any of this, but Daniel right now, is how many times we see how the Bible and the accounts in the Bible are verified. There's so many critics out there that would say, well, that really didn't happen, or that doesn't match history, human history. Well, as we'll look at today, it certainly does. And if there is a disconnect, it's because secular history hasn't caught up with what is in the Bible. And we see that in here. Let's look at this party gone wrong. And in the first 4 verses there, we see how Belshazzar is having this big blasphemous feast. And it starts out, it says, Belshazzar the king. Well, this is one thing that some of the Bible critics said for a long time, saying, well, just wait a minute. Who is Belshazzar? He wasn't the last king of Babylon. There's no record of this Belshazzar being the last. Somebody's not happy. No, not to Sunday school. Those are online. There's a very unhappy child going to the day. But anyway, they're saying, well, there's no record. Who is this Belshazzar guy? Well, as it turns out, and they say, well, what the records show, and I put this on the board because it's just too hard to, is that the last king that they knew about was this Nabonidus. And there was a progression from Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for the 43 years and he died. His son, this evil, how would you like to have that name? Evil Meredith. He came in behind Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for 2 years until he was assassinated. He was replaced by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. He lived 4 years and then died a natural death. His mentally retarded son, Leber Sarnek Hood, he was probably unable to pronounce his own name, but he was beaten to death after only being in power for 9 months. And he was replaced by the group of people that beat him to death. This Nabonidus became the king of Babylon. He was put in power by the group that killed him. He was related to that. And then Belshazzar was this man, Nabonidus' son. And what we learned was that Nabonidus was interested in archaeology and spent a lot of time in Arabia. And he turned the day-to-day operation of the kingdom to his son Belshazzar, who stayed in Babylon and became a co-regent or co-king. And Nabonidus then was out and about, either doing archaeological studies in Arabia or fighting the Medes and the Persians somewhere, but he wasn't here. And this was all discovered just recently, within the last century. They found what was called the Nabonidus cylinder. And it looks to be about this big, like a football with the ends cut off. And it's got all this writing on it all the way around. And it explains all of this. And it hadn't been known before. And so people would look at the account in Daniel and say, well, we know this can't be true because Belshazzar wasn't the last king. We know it was this guy. Well, this cylinder explains how Nabonidus made him the number two ruler, and he day-to-day operations, so he could be free to do what he wanted outside of town. And so that was why it went, and he became a co-regent or number two, and then we'll get to the part later on when Belshazzar is talking to Daniel and says, if you can interpret for me, I'll make you number three in my kingdom. So he couldn't make him number two because he was number two. So he made him number three. So isn't it how amazing that the account in the Bible is actually correct. And until they found that cylinder, which is in the British Museum in London, they didn't know this. John, would you?
So you're saying all these leaders at time, they didn't want them, they just come from out and kill them?
Yeah, it's kind of like taking them to Camp David and make them quit. Yeah, well, they did it. I mean, they basically did it, you know. And where's Joe Biden these days? Yeah, exactly. That it was kind of the way it was. We have the 25th Amendment, and they just go kill them. So it's kind of anyway. So anyway, that's and it says talks about your father. When Daniel later on, we get to the part where Daniel is interpreted, and he says, "Your father Nebuchadnezzar." That is just like we say, Father Abraham. You know, to Abraham was the father. You know, it doesn't mean the immediate father, but it was his ancestor father. Um, so anyway, so we have this. I'm just always encouraged and amazed at how when there is these proofs, if you will, as if we need them. But he says he's making this great feast for his 1,000 lords. And so he's inside. Apparently, the Medes and the Persians were besieging Babylon at that time. I mean, they had to have been close because that night they came in. So he's inside. He's throwing a party. The army's besieging army of the Medes and the Persians is surrounding this city. But he's not worried because he's got the walls of the city of Babylon and they were gigantic. The walls were 90 feet high, 22 feet wide, 17 miles long. I mean, it was a huge city. It was walled by this 90-foot wall, and they had 100-foot high guard towers at the corners on there. And all surrounded had water from the river going through it. They had gates that would allow the water to go through, but people couldn't go through. So he said, not to worry. We'll just party while these guys are outside trying to get in. So well, you know, it's kind of like today. I mean, a lot of we think, well, you know, party today, not to worry that everything is falling apart. Well, let's just throw a party. Another account I read was so it's like mom and dad go on a vacation and they leave their teenage son at the house, and he has keys to the car and he has the house and he knows mom and dad aren't going to be home for a couple of weeks. What does the teenager do? He throws a party. It has a big keg party at the house, and then mom and dad show up. And that's kind of what happens here, the Lord shows up in the middle of this party. And so they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They openly mock God. They commit the sin of sacrilege. And then in verse 5, it says, in the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And of course, that's where we get the expression, the handwriting on the wall. So Belshazzar in verse 6 to 9 is his reaction. He is terrified. It says the king's countenance changed. His thoughts troubled him. So the joints of his hips were loosened, his knees knocked together against each other. The king cried out loud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldean soothsayers. He spoke to the wise men, and he offered them all these riches if they could interpret that. And they couldn't or wouldn't. And he was greatly troubled, it says. So it turned from a merry party to a terrified king. I mean, you could imagine. I mean, it would just raise the hair in the back of your neck. If something started writing on that wall over there, and even today, you're thinking, even, yeah, yeah, they're trying to get in, aren't they? So, um, so Daniel's brought in, and the king or the queen must have been the only one that was really sober. The queen, or may have been his mother, she comes in and says, "Hey, king, live forever. Don't let your thoughts trouble you, or let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom who is the spirit of the in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like wisdom of the gods, were found in him." Um, and he says, he calls him Daniel, whom the king Belshazzar called, or called him Belshazzar. It's interesting. She calls him by his Hebrew name, Daniel. Is kind of maybe out of respect. Nebuchadnezzar called him Belteshazzar, but his Hebrew name was Daniel. Apparently, Daniel was, well, it's like even like in the video counted him as an old man here. A lot of time had passed between, well, you can see the number of years that happened. That he was an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, and then Nebuchadnezzar and all this parade of leaders came in. He was probably not really active in the government leadership at that time, but apparently still remembered, at least by the queen. And to bring him in, he was perhaps retired. But the Belshazzar obviously didn't know who he was, even though he later pretended like he had heard of him. So in verse 13, he says, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light, understanding, excellent wisdom is found in you." Now, he tells how the others hadn't been able to tell, and he says, "Now, if you make known this interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, chain of gold around your neck, and be third ruler in the kingdom." It's kind of like when everything is great and the party's going on nonstop. God and his servants are mocked, made fun of, neglected, and hidden away. But when things get tough, in this case, when the hand of heaven wrote a sobering message, the panic-stricken worldlings cried out for the one who had the Spirit of God. And we kind of see that sometimes, and maybe in our own lives, we kind of, when things are going good, we kind of neglect maybe our devotion to the Lord. There's certainly those that are not believers. It's only when times crisis comes that maybe bring in the man of God, bring in the chaplain, bring in the pastor. It's time now. So in this case, we see that it's kind of exactly what happened. It's kind of the last resort, isn't it? It reminded me, I thought of it during the Battle of the Bulge. General Patton, the Allies were getting beat up pretty good, and they couldn't use their air power. They had superior air power, but they couldn't use it because the weather was so bad. So what does Patton do? He says, "Get me a chaplain. Bring the chaplain in." He brings the chaplain in. He tells the chaplain, "I need a prayer." And so I want a prayer for good weather. It's a true story. So the chaplain puts a prayer together, and Patton reads the prayer, and sure enough, the weather changes, and Patton says, "Pretty good prayer, chaplain." But I mean, Patton probably had no use for the chaplain or anything up until that moment, and that's kind of the way it is, isn't it? It's kind of like Belshazzar had no use for the Lord, no use for Daniel, or the importance of those gold goblets that he was using to sacrilege God. It was sort of like in your face, God. We're just these things were dedicated to worship of God in God's holy temple in Jerusalem, and I'll show you. We're just going to drink wine in them. But then when things changed, it was time to bring in the man of God. Uh-huh.
Look at how the church was swollen after 9/11 for a period of time, and then people just figured that they were okay, and the attendance went down again.
Uh-huh.
In that case, it says, call Billy Graham.
Call Billy Graham. Yeah. Yeah. 911 Billy Graham. Yeah. Yeah. So Daniel then is brought in, and look at verse 17. And just think of why when we as we go through reading this, think of the difference between how Daniel approaches Belshazzar compared to how he approached Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar had the dreams. He says, Daniel, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to somebody else. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all of your ways, you have not glorified. So kind of direct, don't you think? I mean, he lays it right on the line. This compared to when he was with Nebuchadnezzar, he said, "Oh, king, may this be for your enemies. I don't want to tell you this. This is something I don't want to tell you. I wish it was for your enemies." And he pleaded with Nebuchadnezzar to change his ways. But Daniel doesn't take that approach here. It is a very direct approach. And he says, you knew this. You knew this. I mean, not that much time had passed. I mean, you add them up, 7 years or so, maybe, since Nebuchadnezzar had died. He was around. He knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. There's no excuse. And Daniel tells him as such, there's no excuse. And it's basically, he should have known better. And it's kind of the message, we're responsible for the knowledge that we have, aren't we? If we have more knowledge, we are more accountable. And that's the case here. So the fingers wrote these words, verses 24 to 28, many, many, tickle up Harsin. God has numbered your kingdom, and it's finished. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Pretty direct, short, sweet. And that very night, then the Cyrus of the Persians conquered the city, and Belshazzar was killed. And they say there's a Greek historian, there's so many prophecies in here that came true. But Herodotus is this Greek historian. He wrote that Cyrus captured the city by diverting the flow of the Euphrates River into a swamp area. So the water level of the river lowered down, and they were able to march inside the outer walls through the channel where the river was, because now the water was lower and his men could get inside. There was a system of inner and outer walls around Babylon, and inexplicably, unexplained, the inner gates were left open that night, and the Persians just marched right in. Well, surprise, surprise, if you look in places like Isaiah 44 and Jeremiah 51, God predicted, it says, God opened the gates of the city of Babylon for Cyrus. This was written 200 years before. So you can remember when Peter was taken out of the Philippian jail, and the doors just magically opened up, and they just walked out, and nobody touched it. So you can almost imagine these big bronze gates. I mean, these were huge gates. They were just left open for the Persians to walk in and take the city. If they had not been, it would have been very difficult. It would have been delayed. But it's interesting how it was prophesied in Isaiah and Jeremiah 2 centuries before. So it fell, and it fell just like God said. Another interesting thing is the fall of Babylon was after 70 years. And what's significant about 70 years? It was prophesied that the Jews would be in exile for how long? 70 years. So it's like God raised up Babylon to come in and capture, destroy the temple, take the Jews into exile. And when God was done with them after 70 years, Medes and Persians came in, the Babylonian Empire no longer exists. It was like it was built up just for that time period, just for that purpose. So Daniel is promoted. That was probably one of the shortest promotions he ever had, because the kingdom was over that night. But he was, Belshazzar kept his word, and he put a gold chain around his neck and made a proclamation about him being the third ruler. But then that night, Darius the Mede received the kingdom in verse 31. Belshazzar was slain. So what are the lessons? What are some of the lessons? Let's just do a little brainstorm. About don't party when mom and dad are not home. What are some of the lessons?
The word of the Lord is sure.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Is it? So the prophecies, I mean, we see that some of the prophecies that were a long time before, it all came true. The timing it names names. I mean, it names.
See, this actually, last time I did it, I talked about Micah, and all the false prophets were telling Israel that don't worry, we're going to be okay. And they were worried about the Assyrians coming in and destroying the northern and the southern kingdom. And Micah said, no, don't worry about the southern kingdom. You're not going to be taken. It is not time yet. They took the northern kingdom in exile, but Babylon is the one that took the southern kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
it just, people are gonna get tired of hearing me say this, but it's so fascinating to me how all of the Bible, and the Old Testament, New Testament, is interwoven. You can prove things with the Bible, and you can't. It's hard to fight it because these are separated by hundreds of years.
Mhm. Different authors, different.
Authors, yeah.
Yeah, the word of the Lord is true, the prophecies are sure. Is that how you spell prophecies?
God's justice, judgment can come quickly.
Judgment comes quickly, yeah.
But what I was sitting here trying to think about, is sometimes his judgment is slow in coming, and other times it is just, you have a party and the judgment comes. I was trying to think of other examples in the Bible. Sodom and Gomorrah comes to mind. When they went, the men of Sodom went against God's angels, judgment came on Sodom and Gomorrah then. Judgment came now. But what determines when, and the common link there is when God is mocked, or when it's an affront to God himself, not to man, but when it is to God, his judgment is.
Yeah.
You just ask Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah.
I shall not be, how's it, God is not,
I will not be.
I will not be mocked.
I know that, I'm sure there's, somebody else can come up with what like Ananias and Sapphira, many examples of where we sit around and think, God, zap him. I mean, but it's his immediate judgment is determined by him, and how he decides now, and we'll give him some more grace.
You know what I'm smiling at? Remember in the Wednesday night prayer meeting back at,
Mow him down.
yeah, there's a retired missionary in the Wednesday night Bible study back then, and we were in prayer time, and we were praying, forget who we were. There was something bad going on, and he just started said, "Mow him down, Lord, just mow him down." I don't know if that's the best prayer.
Did you say this was written 200 years before it happened?
The prophecies of Babylon falling, and the gates being opened by God was written 200 years before that happened. So when the Medes and Persians attacked the kingdom of Babylon, they were surrounding it there. There's those prophecies spoke about how God would open the gates for the Medes to come in. And that was written 200 years before it actually happened.
That don't make sense.
Well, I mean, it's like the prophecies of the coming Christ, the prophecies of the end times. I mean, these are all written centuries before they happen. We know that the Antichrist is coming. All that's been written years and years before. We have a picture of what those things are like because of those prophecies that have been written in the past. And these were just prophecies that have been fulfilled. They were prophecies of the fall of Babylon, the prophecies of the 70-year exile, and all those things came true.
Writings on walls.
I never heard of that. Never thought about that.
To me, it leads up to one thing, and that is we are living in the end time. And we were created for times such as this.
Mhm.
We've seen,
See if I can get,
look at prophecy in the Bible. How many prophecies have been fulfilled? How many prophecies have yet to be fulfilled? There's just not any prophecies yet to be fulfilled.
before, yeah, that need to be filled before the return of Christ. Yeah, that's. It would seem all of those things, the precursors, the prophecies that have to be in place have all happened. So it could be any time. I thought of one thing is how um, kingdoms um, rot from the inside. I think this shows that the rot there was no seriousness there. It was just a party. I mean, it was they were taking advantage of all the riches. They didn't recognize the dire situation that they were in. Um, um, I mean, you could say this Belshazzar guy was not a serious leader. I mean, if a serious leader would have been looking out and saw the hordes of the Medes and Persians around the city and would be, checking on our readiness. Are you guys ready? Are the gates closed? Everybody got their swords ready. Are the towers manned? And everything. To throw a drunken party, that's not serious. And, and God certainly doesn't take blasphemy. Any other thoughts about this?
Sure sounds like today to me.
Yeah, yeah, that would be, I'll just write that. It sounds like today. Guess we could say human nature hasn't changed.
Underline, look. Back to your lessons learned. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jack.
Okay, back to your lessons learned is lessons not learned. Every time a handwriting on the wall or anything like that came up, they always called their wise men, and they didn't learn to call Daniel first.
No, no. And I think so in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, I think I think he knew what Daniel was going to tell him and really was hoping they didn't have to bring Daniel in. I don't know whether Belshazzar thought about it that way or not, but it's kind of like when you get that box or you're getting a something new that comes unassembled. And when do you read the assembly instructions? Is after you've tried everything else, right? I mean, you definitely don't want to read those. And I like those now. They come out, they say, read me first. So that maybe like you say, Jack, they should have a little sign there on the throne. It says, call Daniel first.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
But in Daniel 4, when 34, Nebuchadnezzar lifting his eyes to the heaven and he's praising God, I think what we learn from this, it doesn't necessarily, his faith at that point, and we talked about whether we'll see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven or not, but his what apparent faith there doesn't automatically go down to the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's almost so generational. I don't know what to call it, generational responsibility. It happened to the Israelites. When they left Egypt, that generation. And you can see that they went downhill. I mean, each succeeding generation was less godly, and until there's a big crisis, and then when we study the book of Judges, there would be a judge, and they would get back on track and worship the Lord, and they would fall off again. There would be another judge, and they'd fall off again, and it's kind of like we don't get. And we see it in our families a lot of times. The faith of the parents doesn't get transferred to the kids in a lot of families.
And one of the proof texts that some people use for Nebuchadnezzar being in heaven is the queen's response. If the queen was actually Nebuchadnezzar's queen, then she called Daniel by his Hebrew name because of the faith that they had and recognizing that Daniel was the prophet of the one true God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, well, next week we'll stay in chapter 5, but we'll look at it. We'll look at one of the lessons by Shane Wood and talk to this chapter and what it tells us about the deception of wealth. And we'll look at that. So, Dee, would you close?
Father, as we close out this lesson, we thank you for it. We thank you for the lessons we learned of that. The responsibility that we have of sharing our faith. It doesn't necessarily just is grasped by those, our children or grandchildren or others around us. We need to share. We thank you for your faithfulness and that your word is true. Thank you for the opportunity to study as we see your truth, and that you will bring your justice and in your timing. It's all about you and your wisdom and your timing. We thank you for that. Trust in that. Give you this time as we go into the service. May our hearts be in tune with you in Jesus' name.
Okay. All right.
Thank
See
you.
y'all. All right.
Bye-bye.
See y'all later. Have a great week.
Flight when you come back.
All right. Have a good trip.